Live, and this is interesting because you are actually my student,
Yeah,
which is
I put some social media out this when before doing the show, and I was like, a previous professor, a previous
right.
podcast.
I know. And I know you also know a lot about podcasting, but so can you just tell me how you got into podcasting and what podcasting was like back in the day?
Yeah, absolutely. And Margaret, thank you so much. I'm actually really quite excited to be on your show tonight. I'm a little nervous because I've never done a live stream podcast
Oh
before.
yeah.
I've been podcasting for 18 years, and I've never done one that's actually like no cutting. There you go. You know what I mean? But
Yeah,
okay, so
I was like you because I started doing just only recorded and then I started live streaming and I won't go back. Like I'll say to people, it's going to be a live stream. And they're like, oh, no, thanks. I'm like, okay. So,
well, I'm happy to talk about how I started podcasting, but I have a quick question for you then, I guess. What what is it about the live stream that you enjoy so much? Is it I'm imagining, is it the parallels to like on air radio and stuff like
yes.
that?
Yeah, because I love being on the air on radio, but obviously I'm not. And it's also it's like you're on the edge. And yeah, I have my questions, but I can't like redo anything. I have to just keep going. So it's exciting to be live. It's much
Yeah.
better than just doing it recording.
I've had a couple classes now at Columbia where we have to do the live reads on the radio, deck or whatever it's called, and just terrified, absolutely terrified when we have to do those things.
Yeah. I know it's like being on a swim, it's like being in a swimming pool and you have to jump off the board and you just have to jump in.
Yes, it's
So,
true. It's true. It's true. So I think if I may, I apologize. You asked just kind of how I got into podcasting.
yeah,
Is that right?
because you are one of the few podcasters. You started podcasting before me. I'm 2009 and you're seriously the first wave of podcasting and a lot of people call themselves experts, but they haven't been podcasting as long as you have.
Well, that's very well. Thank you for even making that implication. It's very flattering. I appreciate it. I remember specifically a moment I had you for a class at Columbia a couple of years back now.
Yes.
I had this whole narrative about how I'm returning to school, and maybe we can speak about that later. But we were in class, and I think in that class, I could tell you knew what you were talking about, and it felt like maybe you could kind of tell that I maybe had a
Yes.
little bit of experience too. So we
A lot of
chatted a little bit.
experience, yeah.
Oh yeah, sure. What's up?
No, a lot of experience. You had a lot of
Oh yeah,
experience.
yeah. Um, and I think we just chatted for a couple seconds after class, and you kind of asked like, "Hey, so when did you get started?" And I said, "Well, I started writing XML code back in 2006 and stuff like that." And you said, "Oh, you were part of the first wave," and I didn't even really know that there were waves. And I kind of did the math, and it's almost 18 years ago now. That is when
Yeah.
I started making shows. Um, for me, I started podcasting. I went to Columbia about 20, 23 years ago for film and video before podcasting even existed as a technology or a medium or anything like that. And long story short, I left my junior year. I got a job in television and I didn't graduate. But a couple of years after that, I think it was just through a series of reading some blog posts and watching a few internet videos. Kind of YouTube was still in its infancy. It really wasn't quite a thing yet. I learned about this thing that was starting to be called podcasting. And obviously, this is before any kind of iPhones or anything like that. In fact, it was what it was that Adam Curry show that kind of made the title of podcasting because it's you cast something to iPods and stuff like that.
Mhm.
And I was at the time I wasn't in television anymore. I was actually on this other journey of running an art gallery, and I was enjoying it very much. But I think I couldn't get the production bug out of my system. And it was really cool to have a storefront art gallery to be selling artwork on a monthly basis. But I had kind of caught wind of this idea, specifically really simple syndication, RSS, and specifically XML code, which both of those were at the time very groundbreaking languages because they allowed the language broad strokes. They allowed the language to go two ways. It wasn't just a website that you were loading on someone's page. It could ping something to say, hey, I have a new blog post. I have a new audio file. And of course, that was the infancy of podcasting. And so when I kind of got into it, I didn't really know what to talk about. I was like, well, I've got this art gallery. I'm doing that with a few other people. That's a lot of fun. Maybe we make a show about what it's like to do this art gallery. And back then, there wasn't any software, there wasn't any services or companies that would write the code for you or provide any of that. So I think I just went mad scientist mode and I just devoured it all. And I learned how to write my own XML by
Which is
hand.
really hard.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm.
Like XML is like so complex. I don't even know how you did it because I mean, even if I just look at a feed, it's so busy.
It's there's it's evolved a little bit along the way. They've created new tags and things like that. But I had to like get my own little server and learn how to post the RSS thing on the server and then post these MP3 files. But anyway, what we did back then is I took a couple of my other we were all just kind of volunteers at this art gallery, and we took one of our back rooms that was going to be an office. And you know how it goes. We turned it into a podcast studio, even though it was basically just a folding table in an empty room. We recorded with analog mics onto like a 16 track that a local theater had literally loaned to me. I kind of begged them. I was like, I don't have any equipment, but I really want to try this thing. And we recorded it into an MP3 recorder onto like what back then the version of an SD card. And then I would take that and move it over to my at the time Mac computer, and I'd edit in Final Cut Pro 3 back then. I was editing the
Wow.
audio because I didn't have any real software or anything like that. But I got into it because there was something about even just iPods, or the fact that we're starting to have gigabytes of memory in things that we were putting in our pockets, and that there was, I was a big fan of audiobooks and stuff like that. I'm very very dyslexic, and so I actually devour audiobooks. I really really enjoy them quite a bit, and there's a whole conversation there about how they've evolved over the years too.
Mm.
But from voice performances to sound effects, I think that they're kind of blending podcast medium too. But maybe that's a conversation for another time.
But you
But
could actually serialize it. I mean, because you know that the essence of podcasting is really the RSS feed. That's what
yeah,
podcasting is.
yeah,
Because
right,
people
and
think the mistake that
yeah.
people make is they think like, oh, podcasting is this kind of format. It's like, no, it's not about the content. Yes, you know that. Okay, so
Well, yeah, totally. But this was part of your lecture in class, and I really appreciated that quite a bit.
well, because I didn't want
It's
people to feel bad that they weren't creating certain kinds of content. I'm like, look, you're creating content, you're syndicating it. That's podcasting. So
and this idea of yes, exactly, exactly, exactly. Just because it's an audio file doesn't make it a podcast. Just because it's a YouTube video doesn't make it a podcast. And it's a little bit of square rectangle, right? Like podcasts can be these other things, but just because they're the other things doesn't necessarily make them be a podcast. Um, and it really was that code. And I just kind of had a little, I don't know, I just had a light bulb go off. I was probably about 24 at the time, and it's easy to say in hindsight, and people say this kind of stuff all the time. It's almost a cliche, but I kind of had this like I was like, wait, I think this is the future kind of moment when I started learning about that. And I thought just that the fact that anyone, it was a little bit like ham radio, but like anyone could make a file if they had a little bit of equipment. Back then you needed more. These days you need less. Um, Anybody, as long as you can make an MP3 file, you can literally send it to the entire world if anyone in the world wants to listen. And I thought that was so cool that I just needed to be a part of it. And so we started making this show called the 716 Fine Art Podcast. And now, of course, the name of the gallery was 716. That's how I started.
is it still up? Is it still up on the internet?
Weirdly, actually, with a class, I'm in a Truth and Lies in the Digital Age class at Columbia right now. I'm a senior, finally, Margaret. I'm very happy about that. First time in my life I've ever been a senior, actually, because I left when I was a junior. So that's kind of a fun little factoid. But um, um, we were doing some internet, there's that website that's the Internet Archive database, and
Yes.
they log. And I actually went back to my old art gallery site, and there were there's a few impressions that were loaded. And I saw some of the old graphics of the podcast and stuff like that. The actual 716 Fine Art Podcast isn't on any active servers right now or anything like that. I have the files in my backup, uh, but we did that show for about 3 or 4 years, and then we closed the gallery. I moved to Milwaukee. I started up a different show called Technophiles Podcast, and ended up doing that one for about 8 years. And we had a couple offshoots there.
Wait, so
Um,
wait, back to the art one though. What was
yeah.
the art one? What did it consist of? How often did you post?
Well, it was, by today's standards, by what we would kind of consider to be a well-produced show, it wasn't. I didn't know what I was doing, but it was basically myself, my co-owner, who was also a Columbia student, back then. And we had two other people that were helping us at the gallery. And every Tuesday night, we'd sit around this table, and we try to break it up into segments. We try to be like, oh, artist of the week or artists we noticed. And we'd have like a session where we kind of talk about the upcoming events at the gallery. Then we'd have maybe like after the second break, we'd have a session where 20 minutes where we would talk about behind the scenes of like what it really took to secure the artists, to get the musicians scheduled for the different events and shows. And I found that I really liked that third portion the most, telling this kind of actually telling a story, almost a bit of a documentary, even by accident, of
Mhm.
this kind of longer story of the gallery. And
Was
so
that weekly or how often?
it was weekly. Yeah. Yeah. We would record. It was because we would record every Tuesday and I'd try to have it out by like Wednesday. It was one of those edit it overnight, don't sleep that night kind of things back then. I've become a smarter producer since then. And I've learned that sometimes that's a bit of a grind. But anyway,
And then what about the technology? Because I remember when you were in class, you were telling me about all the technology that you use just to record. I mean, nowadays it's so much simpler.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, nowadays, if you have to, you can do it by talking into a phone. And we all know that. So what we did back then, as I said it a little bit already, but it was a 16 track. We only used four of the tracks, but it was a 16 track analog, soundboard essentially. It was a soundboard that this theater would use for their production sometimes. I had four microphones, hypercardioid microphones, XLR, just going almost like I was setting up a rock concert because that's just the equipment that was there. You know what I mean? Not the kind of stuff you normally use in a studio. Absolutely no sound proofing in the studio. It was echoey. It's you'd hear doors slamming in the neighboring business and all that kind of stuff. And we were way too far from our microphones. You hear room tone, and that was the production quality. For me, over the course of those 3 or 4 years of making that show, I kind of learned about content. I learned about, okay, what kind of content do I like to actually talk about? I mean, I honestly think those first three seasons, if I may, were probably from a listener point of view, maybe even a little worthless. I'm not sure if there was like a lot of
Well,
value
did
in
you
that
did
content.
you have a lot of listeners?
So we kind of did. At the time, I had a screenshot. I guess I can't really show it on the feed here, but when we posted the show, this is back again. This is like iTunes 4. You know what I mean? iTunes 4.2 or 3 or something was when they finally released the podcast tab on iTunes, and we published the show and we hit new and notable on Apple. And we were also in the top 20. I had a screen grab, a 20-year-old screen grab of this 716 Fine Art podcast in the top 20 podcasts, in that week or whatever it was. And so that was tremendously exciting. I know for a fact that we were only probably getting hundreds of listens. But it was just because the entire medium was in its infancy. This was before we had the major media companies creating like I don't even know, the ABC News podcast. None of that existed yet. It was people in their basements. Dawn and Drew were a couple out up in Wisconsin that actually had a really
Yeah.
popular show for a while. And so
Didn't they come from regular radio?
they might have. I listened to
Okay.
them a little bit for inspiration. I listened to that Adam Curry show with maybe it was the Daily. I forget what it was called now, but that was the first one that really kind of broke the scene. Do you remember what it was called at all? I can
No, I can
barely.
look it up. I just keep talking. I can look it
Yeah, the
up.
Daily Source or something. I don't know, but that was like what like Serial was 7 or 8 years ago. How it
Yeah.
brought podcasting to a new audience. He kind of did that with his show. So yeah, we if speaking in percentages, did quite well. I know we didn't have a lot of
Was it
listeners.
back then? Was it called the No Agenda Show?
No, it was something different, but
Okay.
no
Okay.
worries, no
I'll look it
worries.
up.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So
Um,
then,
yeah.
but then you said, okay, so you did that for a few years, and
hmm
then you did, you said you did another podcast for 8 years.
Well, yes. So I had this art gallery. We ended up running it for about 4 years. I really didn't know. I kind of figured maybe I'd do it forever, but we ended up hitting hard times right around 2008 for obvious reasons, and people stopped buying a lot of artwork, and so I had to kind of close up shop. And in doing that,
Oh, wait,
my gallery,
sorry to
yeah.
interrupt. Was it
Oh,
called
what's
the
up?
Daily Source Code?
Oh, that's what it was. Data
Yeah.
source code. Yeah, yeah. That was, and this is back in the day. I really want to emphasize for anyone who might be listening who's just been podcasting for the past 5 or 10 years. Back then, the iPods didn't even have a podcast option. The way this stuff would go onto your iPod is you'd have to like it was you'd have to download third-party software. It would trick your iPod into thinking that there was an album called the Daily Source Code called 716 Fine Art Podcast, and each episode would be a track. And then every time you plugged your iPod in, it would trick the iPod into thinking there was a new album with different tracks, and that's actually how it was delivered. In those early days before the actual the apps that would do it. But so when I closed the gallery, I knew that I think I I knew that I was more passionate about making the podcast content than I was even probably about the art gallery. In fact, by that time that fourth year hit, maybe it was a bit serendipitous. We were having a hard year. The world was having a hard year financially, and or at least America was. And I even had a very close friend joke once. Then they said like they're like it was by the fourth year I was running the gallery. They were like, sometimes I wonder if you just had the gallery to have content to make the show. And I had to,
Wow.
kind of realize that maybe that was the case.
Yeah.
And so, but it really it taught me that it was something I really wanted to do. And so I moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin,
I love
for a job.
Milwaukee.
I liked it too. I liked it quite a bit. In fact, I was there for a good 10 years. I got lucky and I got a job as a designer at SC Johnson, which is actually in Racine, Wisconsin. But I didn't really want to live in Racine, so I went from Chicago and jumped north all the way up to Milwaukee, then commuted down to Racine. So while I was doing that, I wasn't going to make a podcast about SC Johnson. I wasn't going to make it about being a designer. I didn't know what to do. In fact, I even tried to continue the art show in Milwaukee. It lasted 4 episodes because there wasn't content. Anyways, so I decided at the time, this is 2009, 2010, the podcast market was already saturated with tech news shows, but I thought I'm going to do a tech news show because at least there's news every week and at least I can talk about something. And so we created this show called Technophiles Podcast. And so I would go to SC Johnson during the day and I would work and I'd drive home at night and record episodes and produce them and publish them. And that was also a weekly show. That was a cast of 4 people, so it was similar to 716, but it did kind of evolve over the years. It ended up lasting 8 seasons, 8 years, and cast members would kind of come in and out throughout the seasons and all of that.
But
And
how did you, so was it always about tech or what was it about for 8 years?
that one was, and I am a tech. I'm not a techie, but I think art, tech, science, there's something that's really just fascinating there. You know what I mean? There's always something to talk about. I'm not a gadgety kind of guy. I don't need the newest, coolest thing. But I think just kind of humanity and what we're learning about ourselves and these kinds of breakthroughs, I think this kind of stuff is fascinating. So that's what Technophiles ended up being about. We started, over the seasons, we would kind of start speaking a little bit about video games. We'd speak a little bit about the design industry. And after a while, I started realizing, I think it's not that it was a kids show, but I was like, if I could do one thing with Technophiles, again, this is about 10 years ago, and we were finding some success with that show.
Well,
We didn't have,
how did you get the listeners? You said you found success. How did
yeah.
you get those listeners?
Sometimes it's grassroots brute force. Sometimes, I mean, like I have a show right now, the Zelda podcast, the set that I'm in right now. It's in its 7th season, and it's just because we've been going for 7 years. But back then, Twitter was in its infancy, Facebook was in its infancy. You would push that stuff out every time. We had a website; it was fine, and those were really kind of your only sources. I did not monetize that show. We had a Patreon after a while. Once Patreon was invented, we made a couple bucks. But I realized that from a creative point of view, I was like, if I have one thing that I think I'm really liking about this Technophiles show is we would get feedback. We'd get people tweeting us or messaging us on the website or back then even emailing. And I realized that a lot of the listeners were maybe high school kids or college kids that were almost picking a career or curious about a career. And so by us celebrating some of these emerging technologies and these emerging I don't know, mediums or industries really, I kind of realized I was like, oh, if I could be doing one thing with the show, if I'm kind of helping, even passively helping kids make some choices about what they want to do with their life, that would be really cool. And so that was the I realized that I wasn't making a tech news show anymore, that I was kind of making a show that I was trying to kind of celebrate and inspire. And so that show yielded a couple spin-offs. We had a show called the Technophiles Newscast. All of that is still on YouTube. That was 3 episodes a week. We would talk about the newest news. We would literally stand in front of a green screen. And I've gone back and looked at some of those episodes. Some of them are, the video quality is terrible and stuff, but this is what it was back then.
But wait, but sorry to interrupt, but
Yeah,
when you
no,
were, but
please.
back then when you got your team, how did
Yeah.
you choose the people to be with you?
Yes. So I have kind of one rule, and this even goes into the company that I have now, SixFive Media. I started back in 2017, but the principles that I have in my company now, I realize were birthed during Technophiles podcast and stuff like that. Um, the it was important to me when we started the tech show. It's very easy. I hope this isn't like not a hot take, but I hope this isn't insensitive. But it's very easy to have two dudes with glasses talking about the new computer, right? On these tech shows. And that's cool. But it was really important to me that we tried to have a lot of different perspectives because I wasn't really that interested in talking about the new cool computer. I was really interested in talking about, how is it, how are these things modifying our lives and changing our lives? So I always had a 50-50% male female ratio in the cast. That was always very important to me. Sometimes we would find people that had different perspectives on some of these, pieces of tech. We had a cast member that was very frankly terrified by like any kind of space travel, and we had another cast member that was really quite excited about it. And so by having four people, I usually don't like to have less than three, but by four you could never have. We all got along quite well, but with four people, you could never have anybody really team up on each other, which for me was very important. That everyone felt safe, that they could speak about how they felt about whatever the topic was that we were discussing. And so you couldn't have like the one guy teaming up against two girls or women, and then you couldn't have the women teaming up on a guy. You couldn't have the old one. It was like it was balanced, and so
But were
everyone
these
could
your
have
friends or what? Were these your
oh,
friends?
thank you for that. Yeah, some of them were. Some of them, after the show was going for a while, we would approach people actually and ask them if they wanted to join the show. We After a while, this show went for 8 years, so this show was through the birth of real social media, Instagram, and a lot of the things that live now. The short form video stuff wasn't happening yet. That's obviously more in the past couple of years. But sometimes we would go to a lot of the art gallery conventions still, or the shows in Milwaukee. We'd go to all of the maker expos in Milwaukee, and you'd meet people. And if they seemed kind of interested in the show, if they had a little bit of a presence on their Instagram or something like that, and we felt that they would be a nice voice, pardon me, we would invite them on. It was all voluntary. That show was all just volunteers. Um, and I learned a lot. I learned a lot.
But then fast forward, so you've had the Zelda podcast that's very popular. So how is
Yeah,
that a success?
I'm very lucky, and I'm sitting at my desk where I edit a lot of my audio. But I also, to skip forward a little bit, we do a lot of video content now for the Zelda show, and we have a literal set that we also film ourselves in, and this is a bit of it behind me. Um, I'm very grateful for the Zelda show, but I can speak to how it came to be. We were I was doing the Technophiles show, and I mentioned very quickly that, and I created a company back then called the Technophiles Podcast Network. We made a Technophiles newscast show, like I said. We made a show called the Games Cast. There was one about board games called the Tabletop Test Shop, and we had about 6 or 7 shows going, and it was all just hobby. I was still working at SCJ and just going home at night. You had a gentleman on for your kind of finale back in December, and he spoke to that point a little bit. I forget his name right now, but it was the guy that you'd spoke to 14 years
Oh,
before.
Tom Share.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
oh,
yeah.
oh, oh,
But he
no, no,
said like,
no.
it was the guy from in Toronto. I forget his name. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, Jerry Agar.
Yeah, yeah,
Jerry
yeah.
Agar, yeah.
He made that point about like podcasting. Sometimes it is you're doing your day job and you go home and you gotta grind in the evening
Yeah.
for an hour or two just to make this stuff. And that's what we were doing. So I was kind of in producer mode at this point. This was probably 10 years into me making shows. I was still writing my own XML, which I did for a long time. I chose a company now, a company that one of their owners is here in Chicago actually. But I was still handwriting my XML, but I kind of had my producer sensors up at this point. I was functioning more as a producer than I was even a creator. And I think I'll try to make this a quick story. I was in a play. I was doing a little bit of community theater here and there, which I used to do a bit. And there was this my co-star. She played my character's wife in the show, and so we had a lot of scenes together. We had a lot of scenes not together, backstage. And this is oh my gosh, my camera just freaked out. Um, this is around the time that 2017, and maybe some people know, maybe some people don't, but this is when Breath of the Wild, which is now a very popular Zelda game, had come out. It was a big groundbreaking game. I like video games. I don't play them a ton, um, but I do enjoy them. And if before this show, if anybody would have asked me what my favorite franchise is, it probably would have been. It's probably like SimCity and Zelda. I like games where you get to create stuff. But anyway, um, she was talking about Breath of the Wild, and she was talking about how much she loved it and how much she was her experience, and I was talking about how much I was enjoying the game and how creative it was. And of course, you know how this goes. I'm sure you've had these moments too, Margaret, where I was like, this could be a podcast, this could be a
Yes.
show, you know.
Yeah.
And so I spoke to her about it, and we recorded 2 episodes, like literally in her walk-in closet. Her and her husband live in Milwaukee, and we went in with all the clothes around us, and we just kind of recorded an episode to see what it would be like, see what the format was. And initially I said, well, let's just have it be one of these spin-off shows. It'll be a spin-off show, part of TPN, Technophiles Podcast Network. Not a great name. Um, and it was actually, the first season was branded under the Technophiles umbrella, because that's what I had. That's all I had to my name. And
And did you
we
create like a formal company, like an LLC, when you said it was a network?
well,
TPN.
not SixFive, yes. Technophiles, no. You learn
Okay.
as you go. I've been learning grassroots for the past 18 years of my life, little steps along the way, which has been quite the journey. But so it was a network in that it was realized as a network from a branding point of view on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and all of that. It had its own network website, but it wasn't making enough money to even be a company yet. This Technophiles one. So the Zelda show, we post it, and Technophiles was doing well. It was like in its eighth or ninth season. I was pleased with the analytics, but it wasn't. If I'm being honest with you, it wasn't going to be the path to a career. But it was good enough to keep doing, and we had an audience and stuff. So we post this Zelda show, and I never thought in a million years that like my flagship show would be something about the Legend of Zelda. But we post it, and if my Technophiles analytics were like this, baseline, we post the Zelda show, and it went like this.
Wow.
It just shot up immediately. And within the first 3 or 4 episodes, I was like, oh, I'm in the real internet now. Like this is. I don't think this is the sideshow. I think this is the real show,
Yeah.
because the audience is there. And I got very lucky. We were strategic with the name of the show. For SEO reasons, I labeled it Another Zelda Podcast. So if people are literally searching Zelda Podcast, it comes up in searches and stuff. I think we got lucky there. There
But
was a good six.
were there already Zelda podcasts? Oh yeah,
Yeah,
sorry.
thank you. Yeah, no, no, please. Thank you so much for asking that. There were, in fact, there were about 7 or 8 of them. So we also thought, like, well, let's have a sense of humor about it. We're just another one. Um, and we've become friends with many of those shows now over the years, and it's a very supportive community. But that took off, and so then I sunset Technophiles. I sunset some of these other spin-off shows because we weren't really making them anymore. And I had a little epiphany in 2017. I moved to Chicago, from Milwaukee to Chicago, and I decided, I was working with some companies in Madison. I was working with some companies in Chicago, filmmakers and content creators, and there was a bit of a everybody was helping each other out. You're acting in other people's short films. You're getting hired to do industrial films. Other people are recording audio. And I thought, during the downtime of all these experiences, everybody would talk about the podcast they had, because it was 2017, and everybody was kind of having a podcast at that point. And I don't mean that disrespectfully. Um, and I had a moment where I was like, man, I got these like 5 or 6 or 7 different connections. They're all kind of webbed together. They all kind of know each other, be it people or small companies or whatever. I was like, instead of, the way I did it with Technophiles was like, we made one show, we tried to make more, we tried to make more, tried to make more. What if I made a network that I didn't actually, maybe I executive produced every show, but I didn't actually produce every show? Because I was finding a lot of talented people in my life that I was working with. And so I was driving home from Madison. I've never shared this story. I've told the story of SixFive before, but I've never shared this story before on any kind of podcast. I was doing a commercial. I got hired to do a commercial for like a dentist in Madison, and I finished the gig, and I was driving back to Chicago, and I had a couple hours, to kind of think about things. And I just started putting it together, and I was like, okay, you know what? Okay, we've got AZP, or Another Zelda Podcast. That's a really nice flagship. I think I've got a base there. Maybe I start reaching out to some of these other people and seeing if they want to make a show. And if I can, the idea was, if we can bring them together through brand, and if we can bring them together with analytics, so that when we do start monetizing, we don't just monetize one show, we monetize the package of shows. So yes, it's true, each show might have a slightly different demographic, and that all has to be balanced. But that was really the inspiration, and that was tremendous. So I reached out. We've got 2 more shows in the works, and then I had a rule that every year I would greenlight 3 more shows.
Wow.
And I said no to a lot of them too. Or I'd have a lot of people that would pitch ideas to SixFive, because after a while, and I'm very, very grateful for this. At this point, 7 or 8 years into this experience, my listeners, for example, Another Zelda Podcast, or even the Studio Demands, or some of these other shows we make, they know they're aware of the SixFive brand at this point, and so they'll go see if we have a new SixFive show come out. I receive the feedback, and we also see it in the analytics when certain a
Well,
Zelda episode. Yeah, pardon me. What's
no,
up?
what's the criteria when, or what was the criteria when people approached you?
Mm. Well, I knew I didn't want it to be just video games, because I do have a passion for art and culture and science and all these kinds of things, and what it even means to be a human and all that. Um, but the we do have a couple rules at SixFive, and I kind of came up with these rules. So sorry, pretty early on, and they were pretty organic. I wanted all the content. Some of it was designed from the back end, and some of it was designed creative. And so the criteria that I would look for when someone was coming to me with a new idea, once in a while I would reach out to some talented people that I knew, but a lot of times, things would get pitched at us. Um,
That's a great position to be in.
I mean, we were microscopic. We were this teeny tiny little company, but yeah, it was enough that there was some attention there that people were coming and say, "Hey, I got an idea, I got a show," and it's so cool. And so every SixFive Media show, and this is still true today, needs to be evergreen. So we don't do any news shows. I want every single episode that's ever created to still have value because I want to be able to put ads on it. We have people that listen to season one of another Zelda podcast right now, and it's just as valuable. It's like a Netflix show. It's like just as valuable now as it was 7 years ago. And so every show needs to be evergreen. We do a kind of a weird thing at SixFive where we post our episodes bi-weekly, not every week. I find that works actually pretty well. And actually, once you start getting the shows up into a Patreon situation, you're posting an episode every week anyway, because you're posting like the week early episode and all that kind of stuff. But I digress. Um, and it was very important to me that from a branding point of view, that all the shows wanted to celebrate something. It's a bit cheesy, but I would always use the term like, we love to love things. What's something that you love and what do you want to talk about? And by you talking about it, will it excite and inspire other people about either that subject or subjects adjacent to it? For example, even with the Zelda show, we still talk about coding and we still talk about design and we still talk about, I still kind of hope and imagine in my head that there's high schoolers listening to that show that go like, oh, maybe I could get into game design or something. We're doing it through the lens of talking about all these different narratives. But so if someone came to me and they said, I want to do a news show or I want to do a show where I make fun of movies or films, I would be less, there's nothing wrong with that kind of content, but I was less interested in it. It's also still important. One of the things I had to make sure I was balancing as a producer was making sure that that content isn't just fluffy gold too. You want there to be some critical, points of view, which I think brings value. I think a great example when we were kind of in our second wave of shows, we're kind of in our third wave now. It's been 6 or 7 years. Um, I was approached by two guys who wanted to do a show called Fan Fiction. FIX-TION is what we ended up calling it. And they wanted to take popular either video games or comic book content, and then they wanted to like rewrite their own fan fiction to it. And I thought it was a great idea. I thought it was actually, I'd like to lump another show into this too. We have our second show we ever made is a show called The Studio Demands It, and it's two screenwriters, active working screenwriters in California, and they work on gigs. But what we do is we have the listeners pretend that they're studios and they pitch quote unquote terrible ideas. Titanic 2 or Face Off 3, but you have to CGI Sean Connery back in, just like all maybe the possible horrible things that maybe would come along in the industry. And these two screenwriters, they don't know the topic ahead of time. They have an hour to pitch a show. And so for both of these shows, Fan Fiction and The Studio Demands It, we had to have a lot of conversations about, okay, well, what is the show really about? Studio Demands It is a celebration of screenwriting. It's not, gee gosh, I didn't like that Batman movie. You know what I mean? And so we had to kind of, I would always really spend a lot of energy framing and making sure that the shows fit the brand for a couple reasons. That's the kind of stuff I want to make. It keeps my demographics in the same category. And I also have one other rule with SixFive shows, and this is a pretty strict one. I've only broken the rule once or twice, but they always have to be. I always tell new creators it's very important to me that they are SFW, that they're suitable for work. I'm not personally offended by curse words or swearing or anything like that, but I like the idea that you could play it on a Bluetooth speaker in the office maybe or in the garage, and no one's going to go what or actually I'll be honest with you, I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but if there was a kid listening to, let's say, the Zelda show, and we were talking about game design, and we were cursing left and right, and their parents walked by and said, "What are you listening to? No, you can't listen to this." My heart would be broken, right? Like
Yeah.
that's not the agenda. And so I'd always say, we don't make kids shows. We make shows for everybody, but just
Like
make them
safe
suitable for
shows.
work.
Safe
Yeah.
shows.
And what I found was, especially like even with the fan fiction guys, their mouths were so dirty in common casual conversation. If I may, I hope I'm not embarrassing them. But you find that sometimes language like that can be a little bit of a crutch, and they had to get a little bit more, become more eloquent with their critiques and stuff like that. And I thought it was really nice. So, so those are some of the identifiers. I had a couple shows pitched at me that just wouldn't really quite fit, and that's totally okay. Sometimes I still help them learn about the production, and maybe they go make it somewhere else. And I hope that that's answering your question. It was a bit long-winded.
Yeah. No. You answered it. So then, so Zelda, and then you got into other ones too. So what about the Columbia one? Is that the next one that you did?
Well, yeah. So for the longest time, my voice, so to speak, I was only hosting the Zelda show, and we made 6 or 7 other shows with these other people. And we also, another thing you can do with a network is you can just naturally have your hosts of different shows guest on each other's shows, and we would really do that a lot. So you'd have a new show that maybe didn't have an audience, but they'd bring an audience by doing these crossovers. Okay. Um, so I was only making another Zelda podcast for a couple years, really trying to focus on being an executive producer more. And yeah, I think you're right. I think the Columbia show, which I'll be more than happy to talk about in a second here, was the next show that I really hosted or
Yeah,
really
because
kind
remember
of
when I
made
met you,
myself.
you mentioned Zelda, and then you were
Yeah.
developing this other show.
So it was, I think, so I had a massive life change happen while I was doing SixFive. In 2017, started the company. Wasn't at SC Johnson anymore. I was bouncing around a little bit here in Chicago looking for design work. I ended up working as a manager at a Target for a couple of years just to kind of, get by and all of that. And I was through certain means, I was given the opportunity. It was proposed to me, and I was given the opportunity to possibly go back to school. And at first, I was not into the idea at all. I thought, no, I've been getting by for 20 years. I was working at SC Johnson. I got really lucky, and I worked for the Oprah Show for a couple of years. I did it all without a degree. I actually was almost proud of the fact that I didn't have a degree. It's a little bit of a punk attitude. But there was a time about 4 years ago where I was realizing, I'm loving making shows. I'm loving producing shows. I'm loving helping other people make shows, and I'm really loving this kind of like making a company thing. Like it's exciting, and I really started thinking, I need to make some choices in my life where this can be my career instead of just doing, as your previous guest said, 2 hours at night, trying to scrounge through. And even though SixFive Media has been on a nice trajectory, a trajectory I'm very proud of, we are monetizing some of our shows at this point. Um, it wasn't enough you still wasn't enough to buy a house, right? I guess you could say. And I thought to myself, well, okay, what if I could work in the industry as a podcast producer for another company during the day and then kind of do this, dream project at SixFive in the evening still. But at least during the day, I'm still making content that I care about and exercising those muscles instead of going to a different job where you're kind of not really using
Mhm.
those skills. And so I started applying for podcasting jobs, and it was so funny because at that point the industry was about 15 years old. This is about 3-4 years ago, about a year before I met you, and at that point, these job postings were on Indeed.com, on all these other things, and one of the first things you need to enter a lot of this stuff was where'd you get your degree? And I was getting blocked by a lot of opportunities by not having my degree. Whereas 10 years before, I don't know, you'd have a paper resume back then, and like maybe that stuff just maybe the computers weren't filtering it as much, really. You know what I mean? Let's face it.
Yeah.
And so I was having a heck of a time finding a career, I'll be honest. And so I took the opportunity to go back to school. Originally, I thought maybe I'd just go to a city school or something and uh, just finish the degree or whatever. But long story short, I decided to go back to Columbia through a little bit of coercion and recommendations. And when I decided to come back to Columbia, I discovered essentially the communications department, even though I was filming video the first time around. And I discovered that there was a I guess you could say, a podcasting track through the radio department, through the
Mm.
communications department. And my jaw dropped when I saw this curriculum when I was going through the classes. I thought, are you kidding me? I can go to school for podcasting. It didn't even exist the first time. Now there's curriculum for this thing that I've been doing for 15 years, learning it as I go. But now they're teaching this in schools. This is amazing. I got to be a part of it. And so yes, I chose to go back. I chose to have my major be in this direction. And at that point, I was enough of a producer to get to this returning student. Returning student's the name of the Columbia show, the show where I go back to Columbia. Where I thought, well, this is crazy. I left when I was 20 years old. I'm 40. I'm 43 now, but at the time I was 40. And I thought, that is just fun math. You leave at 20, exactly 20 years later, you go back to the exact same school, like some of the same buildings. I was walking through the same doors 20 years later, talking, this weird little time warp thing. Um, I kind of thought I have to make a show about this. This is a once in a lifetime opportunity of content, I guess, right?
Yeah.
And I also was really getting excited. A lot of the shows for SixFive are essentially people sitting at desks talking about things, which is what most podcasts are. But over the years, I had gotten, I mentioned Serial earlier, but I was really finding myself intrigued by these kind of narrative shows that were happening, the more storytelling style shows where there's music and sound effects, and
Which is like old time radio. Like golden age
yes,
of radio was that. So that
100%.
so that kind of podcasting's not new.
No, no, I agree completely. You're absolutely right. I actually think hopefully we can finish this conversation with a discussion about how a lot of this stuff's merging. But I'll move it along a little bit here. But I thought, this is going to be as a personal goal. I know how to make a show where people sit at a desk and talk about stuff at this point, is what I was thinking to myself. And that's satisfying. But I thought I really, really, really want to try to make one of these storytelling style, in depth, um, tons of post production. It takes a month to make an episode kind of shows. And I decided that I would have returning student be that. And then I thought, well, how do I do this? Can I speak to my professors? Can I interview them? Is it long form interview, or is it a bit like what we're doing right now, or is it storytelling? Is it what? How do I blend the genres? What am I going to do? Is it documentary? And so I made a lot of choices, and I'm tremendously proud of this show. I'm actually getting a little emotional right now thinking about it. But Returning Student is a documentary style podcast about my return to Columbia. And there are storytelling moments in the show. There are documentary style moments in the show. And then there's also long form interviews in the show. And I'm very proud of, if I may speak personally, and you as a producer, Margaret, I think, we talked about this a little bit in your class. Those are three separate podcast genres. And I'm very, very proud for anybody who's an editor. I'm tremendously proud, more than anything, of how I've been able to, as a producer, navigate through those genres, even in a single episode. And it's been a tremendous experience. I almost feel like I'm really proud of the Zelda show. I'm really proud of these other shows. I'm making a show about AI right now that I'm really also very excited about. But I think like Returning Student, that one I'm putting my heart into. That one I'm kind of like bleeding for, and I almost feel like I'm writing a book more than I'm making a podcast.
Well, is returning student, is it done or are you
No.
okay, okay.
No. Well, okay. So
Yeah, I'm
the
confused.
it
Like, what are
is
you working on now?
yeah, yeah. The Returning Student is I'm a one for that show. Normally, you wouldn't make a storytelling narrative documentary show with one person. You normally have a team of at least five people working on this stuff. At the bare minimum. So when it's just me, it really does take about a month to make an episode. And when I say a month, probably if you're working, a couple hours a night, maybe if it was a full-time gig, you could do it in a week or something like that if you're actually doing 40 hours a week. So maybe it's 40 hours an episode. But anyway, the show, I've produced the first 7 episodes. It's still in season one. And but I'm collecting content. I'm collecting interviews. I'm still interviewing all my professors and everything, Margaret. Like we had our interview a couple of years back.
Yeah, did you ever
I'm
post that interview?
Well, it's in the queue. It's going to
Okay,
be
okay.
that's part of season 3. So
Okay.
season 1 is what's coming out right now, and
Wow, okay.
I'm technically living in season 8 right now. Us doing this, I recorded a segment just before us doing this. That's going to be on Returning Student, in a couple of years. Um, that show obviously is mega evergreen. I think once the whole thing publishes in its entirety, which will be 9 total seasons, 9 episodes a season, 9 seasons, I don't even know if that's like, this is what I was kind of speaking to earlier. I don't know if it's a podcast in its delivery form, but it's kind of an audio book. It's kind of a radio show. It's kind of a radio play. It's kind of a film, but through audio. And I'm just very proud of it. So what am I working on right now? Returning students I've had a couple of life changes in the past year, schedule changes, work changes. And it's become very difficult to produce returning students right now. I'm trying to figure it out, but I'm not too worried about it because I know that I have all of this. I have 3 or 4 years of content built up, and eventually this kind of bio pick podcast is going to come out. So I'm happy about that. What I'm working on specifically right now is really the Zelda show is still the lead.
And
It's
it's
the
still
one
doing well. And it's still doing well.
still grows. It's growing exponentially every year. We show a minimum of 20% growth every single season.
Wow.
Oh, that was one other thing that I didn't mention. Every SixFive show has to be, this is just a personal thing. I don't even know why. I just like it. Has to be produced in seasons. So we build every show as seasons. So it's like we will say yes to a 12 episode season, or we'll say yes to a 24 episode season to a show. And even though, because that's something that's kind of fun, because when you think about a podcast, you do think about it being the thing that comes out each week, maybe a bit like a radio show or an old school TV show. And it's kind of fun to not have the episodes come out every week, have them come out every other, have there be an emotional arc to the show, even if it's just the show talking about these screenwriters doing their thing, or we're talking about Zelda. We have a Pokemon show now. Um, the audience can create emotional arcs. They know that they're in their mid-season break. They know that there's 5 more episodes to this season, and then the show will take off for 2 months. And then season 9 will come back for that show, and you can do a whole nother social campaign and a whole nother push. And so by having these kind of ebbs and flows of the shows, I find that gives me a really nice way to push, frankly, marketing when it gives you kind of built-in
Well, that's how TV was for a
points.
long
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
Because
And
every
I would
season.
say that prestige television, or on demand stuff like Severance, the finale's coming out tomorrow, is kind of doing a similar thing too. 10 episodes, and you wait 2 years, and then it comes out, and everybody talks about it. And so we kind of took that idea. I wanted to elevate the content a little bit, where all respect to people that make a show every day or every week or do a news show, tons of respect. But for me, I think I want to make, I don't know if I want to make the newspaper version of podcasting. I think I want to make the magazine style of podcasting, where you can sit on it a little longer. And so that's been a lot of fun. So specifically right now, Zelda it's cusping. We do make some money off of it. It's cusping. I'm comfortable talking about this. My analytics have recently shown that if I were to really truly focus on proper monetization, not just some monetization here and there, we still make money from our Patreon and all that. But if I were to like really buckle down and properly have a couple ads in every single episode, the the income from the show would rival what my little like day gig job
Wow.
does right now.
That's
And so I'm
incredible.
I'm so excited about this. My heart's beating right now talking about it, and it's terrifying because it's like, how do you flip the switch? How do you stop going to the day job? Um, how do you make how do you make finding those advertisers the day job? You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
we're right on the cusp.
Wow.
I think it's inevitable in the next year. I think I'll find the answer. So I'm very focused on AZP, but personally, I have another show called an artificial podcast, and that one I just started about 6 months ago, and it was through WCRX. It was part of the WCRX practicum class that I had it with Matt actually. And so I think you're probably familiar with that class as well. But it's initially started as a show that would go out on WCRX. So I had to make a radio edit and a podcast edit for every episode. That was kind of fun. You put the drops in every 10 minutes for the radio version. I'd let the podcast version go a little longer. Um, but in this show, my co-host is literally an AI chatbot. And so it's me and quote unquote her, but really it, even though I've chosen a female voice right now, just because I think that's interesting. I think I'm kind of challenging the listeners a little bit I'm almost challenging them to not make an emotional relationship with this voice
But how did you
that's
create
happening.
that voice?
Yeah,
AI.
sure. So the way I do it specifically is I'm not using anything too crazy from a software point of view. I'm really truly just using the Chat GPT chat mode on my iPhone. And you can get it on your iPad too, or iPad as well.
Is that
In fact, I
is
had
that with the subscription, the Plus? ChatGPT Plus?
Hot take, I'm not even using the subscription yet. I actually think I'm
Oh.
going to upgrade to the subscription for the season 2 of an artificial podcast and like upgrade the AI. It's very sci-fi. But no, I'm still using the base model. And what I'm doing is I'm just exploring topics in every episode. And we talk about the environment, we talk about space time, we talk about relationships, we talk about family, and I have conversations with this AI, and it's an absolute blast. And obviously, like, I don't know exactly where I sit. I think the AI stuff's inevitable. I do use it in my workflow. I think we're still at a point where there's a lot of consequences. But what I'm exploring in this show are what are the emotional consequences of having
Mm.
AI in your life. And there's been plenty of times where it has been really quite flattering to me when there's ideas. And I can imagine a scenario where you have this nice, as a male, have a nice female voice speaking to you, or vice versa, or flop it, or whatever anybody prefers. And you start thinking, wow, this AI really knows me. It really gets me.
Well, it's like
And
that.
you,
Well,
and
it's
you,
like that New York Times article about that woman who had an AI partner. I mean, she was married, but she had this AI guy,
yeah,
and she became emotionally attached to the AI guy.
it's is it what is it called? Parasocial relationships or something like that, where you build emotions on an emotionless thing. But yeah, so I'm kind of exploring that in this show. It's a lot of fun. It's definitely an art project. I consider it more of a sculpture than even a podcast. And so those are just quick little episodes, 30-minute episodes. And
Wait, so where do you post all these things? Are they all on your network? Like, what's your website?
oh yeah, thanks. Oh, actually, I want to speak to one more thing about the AI show.
Yeah.
I got a little off topic. You asked how do I actually record it? And I literally I take my phone, whoops, I take this little old iPhone, I do a lightning out to analog. The analog goes into an old MP3 like DAT recorder or whatever. I record to an SD, and then I have Audition running. I have a little recording booth over here that I do a lot of my voiceover stuff for. So I wear one earphone coming from the phone so I can hear its voice. I wear another earphone on the other side so I can hear my own levels. I speak into Audition as it records. Then I have a audio splitter coming out of the phone, an analog audio splitter, kind of old school. That is a line in mic into the computer as an analog mic. And so it hits the MP3 recorder, it hits the computer. And then in post, what I do, I never change what it says, but I do kind of tighten up the pauses in post.
Yeah.
That's the only thing I do. And I'm very transparent about that. But honestly, what's kind of fun about that? You know this as well as I do. That's what you do with a human anyway. If you're interviewing a human, you tighten it up a little, you know?
Yeah.
So that's how I literally record that show, which is a lot different than how we do the Zelda show. So you had asked me something else. I apologize. Oh yeah, where do they all post? Up until about 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I still had my own server, SixFive Media, and I was still posting all the stuff on my own server, still handwriting all my XML. I was handwriting my XML when I was in your class still. Um, but we were getting to that point where we were getting enough listeners that I could tell that I wanted to have proper monetization, proper ads in the shows. And yeah, we'd put ad breaks in our shows, but all the ads were just promos for the other podcasts in my network, and they were all baked into the MP3. They were not dynamic. You put that thing in there, and you'd export your MP3, and if you wanted to change it, you'd have to export a new MP3.
Mhm.
And so, without getting into the weeds too much, I did a lot of research about 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, because I knew that I wanted to start being able to actually put proper ads into these shows, and I wanted to put them in dynamically, where you can have an ad run for a week, a month, 6 weeks. You can have an ad run for certain episodes. You can have an ad run for your entire library for 1 week, and you can charge all these different packages when it comes to where those ads go. And furthermore, there were two other variables. Um, Spotify, the way that they take in their code is very, they kind of, I don't want to speak, oh, well, I kind of want to be careful about how I say this because it's their business model and I understand that. But if you're not paying for certain, not firewalls, but like certain stop gates,
Yeah.
you don't get a lot of access to their, I guess, their library. And what I mean by that is if you aren't finding a way in to pay them a kind of a literal fee through a lot of different means, if you post an MP3 through your own handwritten XML, they take that file, they duplicate it onto their own server, and that's it. It lives there. You can't change it ever again. So goodbye to dynamic ads if you want to re-export an MP3 and put a new ad in. Furthermore, sometimes I had issues with Spotify where I'd have half an upload happen because maybe a network outage or something. And that half an episode would live on Spotify indefinitely forever because they moved it to their own servers. Their
That's what I
logic
always say to
was
people. Like I always say to people, I mean, Spotify is great, but it's free, but you're within their world.
you're
So
within their world, and I've learned how to navigate it. It was a bit off-putting when I was writing my own code, and it was even challenging. But then, and whereas Apple wouldn't do that, I'm not saying that Apple's better or worse. It's just different business models. Um, but then something happened with Apple that was very interesting. About 2 years ago, this is kind of an industry standard thing, but I got a message. You have your Apple account, your podcast creator account for Apple, you have your podcast creator account for Spotify, and so forth. But some of the other companies, and I got an email from them saying, it was to everybody, but it was obviously, you know, uh, uh, not a spam email, but sent to everybody that was one of their users. It said, hey, by this date, we're going to require all of our shows to have the HTTPS security in the URL, and my server wasn't secure in that way. It was just an HTTP. I had it since 2000, 12 or whatever, and or 2017 specifically. And I did not have the know. That was a little beyond my means. I knew how to write XML code. I was not a server. I knew how to buy some server space and upload some files on an FTP. But other than that, I wasn't skilled enough to write this new or have this secure language. And so I had about 6 or 7 months, and basically Apple said, we just want to give everyone a warning. If you don't have this HTTPS in your URL, which makes a lot of sense. It is a significantly more secure. It's like
right.
everything should be HTTPS these days. I totally believe in it. It wasn't a problem,
Yeah.
but um, I had to find a way to switch. So I had this Spotify problem. I had this Apple problem, and so I started searching for companies. I thought, okay, maybe it's time. Oh, and I had this dynamic ad problem. I thought, all right, maybe it's time. This is after I had your class. This is since then. So I know we've chatted a little bit online since then, but this is since you and I have had any real conversations. I did a lot of research on a bunch of different companies, and actually, the curriculum in your class would have students find different providers, Libsyn and Podchaser, and all those different things. I actually recall that, but I ended up finding a company called Transistor. I think it's transistor.fm or something is their actual URL, and they provided everything that I really, really wanted, everything that I wish I could have done with my code. They had the dynamic ad placement where they organically bake MP3s every time you change the ad. You can change them on a whim, and they have a software that makes a new MP3. They had a relationship with Spotify, um, to get you through those firewalls so you could re-upload new files, and it wasn't permanently baked into Spotify. You could change these days. I can change something within a second, and I'll see it on Spotify, sometimes
That's
quicker than
good.
Apple Podcasts.
Yeah, that's quicker. Yeah.
Um, and they offer this HTTPS output, secure thing. And I've done a little bit of research with them. One of their founders lives here in Chicago. We're friends on LinkedIn now, or at least we're connected on LinkedIn. We chatted a little bit, and they are so cool. They're a tiny little company, 5, 6 people, I think. Um, but they have these things, and I actually had an opportunity to speak with a few of them a few months ago. They were reaching out to some of their users of a certain degree, I guess, about like how the product was working and all that. So I was able to sit down with, I don't know if it was like their HR department or one of their coders. I don't know exactly what person I was speaking with, but he was wonderful. And we talked about all the different things that we liked about Transistor, and he kind of explained
That's fun.
their journey with finding their relationship with Spotify, their journey with finding their relationship with Apple, and all that kind of stuff. So I think that might be a story for another time. But
Yeah, I'm looking them up. Yeah.
that's who I use now. They've got some big clients as well. We're big enough, but we're teeny tiny little babies for them. Um,
No, okay, my last question, because I know that you have to go soon. How have you seen podcasting changing, over the years?
yeah,
Because like since you're an early adopter.
yeah. The You were talking about waves earlier.
Well, I call you the first wave because I'd say I'm the second wave because after the technology changed and everybody jumped on board, then it just became saturated and that's it.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Yeah, when back in those early days, it was a really special kind of thing.
yeah.
And then I remember conversations about when Apple, it was mixed emotions when Apple put their podcast reader inside iTunes. It was like, cool, we're being given to the masses. And certainly I saw that with my 716 show. All of a sudden, more people were listening. Um, But at the same time, that's when you started seeing large radio companies or large production companies or television companies taking some of their shows and just exporting an MP3 and calling it a podcast and throwing it out there. And some of the purists are like, oh, I don't know if that's really a
But it is a
podcast.
podcast. No, it is a See, that's what I'm
I,
saying.
I
That's why.
I think by today's standards, it 100% is. Back then, it was like we
Yeah.
were still trying to define what it is. I agree with you completely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And now we're challenged by things like YouTube has the
Video.
podcast tag now. You know what I mean? And
Yes.
so I think for me, what I saw change was you saw the indie stuff, then the big companies came in and kind of flooded the market a little bit. But then what you started seeing were almost like indie companies. So you'd see smaller
Yeah.
little companies make shows that were still rising up and coming out of the woodwork, so to speak, that were, in my opinion, ambassadors for people who weren't familiar with podcasting. They would learn about them. I am tremendously grateful for a certain amount of podcasts that are out there that I think have brought, a larger audience to being comfortable with going onto a podcast app and finding new shows and all that kind of stuff. Um, where
But
it's
what
at
about like? But I
now,
think, but it seems like it seems like it's harder to get listeners now.
interesting. I don't know if I feel that way. That's interesting. I don't
Well, I think for a
disagree.
lot of people it's hard. But okay, so
Yeah.
how come you don't feel that way?
Well, I think there's data out there suggesting that podcasting is basically doubling every year right now. The people creating it and the people listening. So if you make a show about The Legend of Zelda, yeah, there's just that many more people that are clicking around saying they might, clicking on the internet saying, I think I want to listen to a Zelda podcast. I think there's more people listening, and I think that that's good. I do think that, to your point, shows shows that are a bit more specific do a little better in this climate. Something like a Zelda podcast, or a Star Wars podcast, or a Severance podcast, or a whatever, or a wine podcast, or an art podcast. Who knows? Um, or you go the other end of the spectrum where the people are tuning in for a specific personality, which harkens back a little bit more to that talk radio stuff. Like the Joe Rogan stuff, or they're kind of tuning in for him, so to speak. So I do find that the shows that SixFive has made, where the hook might be a little less specific, those shows struggle more. I think that's a really good point, actually. Um, and so sometimes it's in the naming. You got to make sure that like the name hits. I try to have the episodes be, even the title of episodes, people know what they're signing up for, but I could probably talk about this for the next 4 hours. So I think there's more people listening. I think there's more outlets. I don't think having my show on YouTube is a threat. I love that, especially, and also another thing Transistor provides is they'll pump you out to all 20 or 30 of the different podcatchers that are out there. And I saw my numbers increase when that happened. Um, so I don't know. I think for me, my experience is that it's a little bit of a heyday right now, actually. It's
That's
kind of all
good.
over the place. I will say, like, returning student, that's a great example. That's not a blowout hit. I don't know if returning student would be doing that well if it wasn't in my network. It's because I have these other shows that are the analytics. The returning student analytics are fine. They're like the old days. You get like 10,000 listeners, and you're kind of like, okay, we're good. Um, but you get these other shows that are bigger, that you put the ads in those shows, and then of course this was the design all along, that you start getting people that are subscribing to the brand of SixFive. So they go, oh, this is the new SixFive show that's out. I'm going to go listen. Or another thing that I found that I kind of fell into, but I'd like to point this out, by doing this season thing for all the different shows, we offset when those seasons happen. So it's not like the whole network goes down for 2 months or 3 months. In fact, I actually have like a programming. I have a huge spreadsheet that shows me quarterly the year. We're programmed out for the next like year and a half if things change, but like we kind of know which shows are coming in when, and when they're going to finish their mid seasons, and when they're going to hit their ends of their seasons. And so a great example of that is um, the Zelda show has become popular enough that we had our first ever spin-off show, and it's called Another Pokemon Podcast. And I got the graphic here. It looks just
I'm
like
sure
it, but it
that's
says
popular. Are there a lot
Pokemon.
of Pokemon? Are there a lot of Pokemon podcasts competing?
There's a lot, and there's some quite well. And here's the thing: I don't actually know much about Pokemon at all. I'm too old. I think I was already in high school when those first two, the Red and Blue for original Game Boy, was even coming out. It's not that I don't like Pokemon, I just wasn't the I'm not the target. And so that's been really interesting because what we did with the Pokemon podcast is just as AZP was finishing season 6, and I knew that I was going to be on about a 3 month hiatus for AZP. We popped the first season of another Pokemon podcast to hit, and so we actually put ads in the finale. Go check out another Pokemon podcast, and then they did well. And then what happened was when we started season 7 for AZP, you saw the analytics pop on the Pokemon show because now they're supporting each other. There's literal ads for each show. Um, Whenever we want to bring a new show in, there's you can kind of tell the seasons have little arcs to them, and so I don't know. Maybe I'm getting a little long winded about that, but that's kind of to that point. Not only is it about making podcasts that are artistic and interesting, and you're editing, you're also designing shows, but you're also designing seasons. You know what I mean? And that's really you're kind of making a garden, and it's that's really where the fun is for me. I have to say.
Okay, so I know you have to go, so anything that you want to add?
um, Anything I want to add? I think we we I had an opportunity just about 2 weeks ago. It was a little surreal, Margaret. It was that podcasting one class still exists at Columbia, and a professor named Yanti is teaching it right now. And he approached me and asked if I would speak to the class.
Nice.
And obviously, to your credit, I was very flattered. You had me kind of speak about things here and there, and when you had a class, I jumped in for a half a session and speak, and that was really awesome. It was really cool. Um, Actually, as a side note, I feel like I'm making better relationships with my professors going back to school than I am with the students, and that's all very
Well, you're
that's
at a
even
different stage, that's why.
yeah, it's true. It's true. I mean, even stuff like this is speaking more to that. That's a little surreal. But going back to school, and you're kind of like, oh, I'm actually closer in age and disposition to my professors than I am with my fellow students. But anyways, so the Yanti asked me to come in and actually do like a proper lecture. I put an hour and a half lecture together for that class with a deck and everything, and it was so cool. But I asked in that lecture, I asked like, what is a podcast? This is stuff we used to talk about in your class and other classes and all the rest. And I made a little Venn diagram. And what you learn is where podcasting is now, and I think this is a good thing. I think that this is just bigger and bigger, growing more and more. Did you know that my analytics show that the second most listened to format is smart home devices for my
Wow.
podcasts, by the way.
Wow.
So it's the iPhones and the whatevers, and then it's like the web and browsers and stuff. But the second most popular one is the home pods and the Alexas and stuff. And that's speaking to that's kind of a harkening back to like the radio in the living room thing, if you really think about it.
Yeah, that's
I think we're
cool.
going full circle with some of this stuff. But so where is podcasting now? I think it's if you ask like how did TV change? I don't even want to use radio; it's too close because I think radio and podcasting are in the same narrative. But if you talk about how television's changed over the years, and back in the '90s or certainly before, but let's just say the '90s when you're watching Home Improvement and every episode kind of returns to form, and you log in each week, you tune in each week to watch the shows, and it was kind of filling space and filling time. And yes, there was good stuff, and then we started hitting kind of prestige television with paid networks like HBO. But then when we went into streaming, especially with Netflix and other things, the format changed. You didn't need commercials anymore. That was the first most obvious thing, freaking out my camera. Um, you didn't need to be set to a certain time, and then all of a sudden you could have like seasons of shows, and we're seeing that that's just normal now. So like what is a TV show now compared to what a TV show was 20 years ago? I think it's completely different. Do we still call it TV? It's not coming through the airwaves anymore. It's being downloaded through IP. I mean, honestly, you and I both know this, but XML still runs those TV apps. The Disney Pluses and the Netflixes. Some of their base code is still XML. It's like it's still that syndication code that was written 18, 20 years ago, which actually started with blogs too. But anyway, my thing's falling apart here. So um, I think that podcasting now is in a place where I would like to think that it's elevated may not be the right word, but matured enough into this space where um well, at least let me put it this way. What I'm finding most rewarding about the medium right now is that I feel like I can tell stories that are longer and slower. And I don't have to worry about, yes, there's ads and monetization, but I don't have to worry about making sure I say the time and temperature every 12 minutes or whatever it is. And I like that. Um, I like that I can like put a solid beat in an episode, especially like returning student, these narrative ones. Sometimes I let it sit, you know what I mean? And so to that point, when I listen to a bunch of audiobooks, like I said, and some of the Star Wars ones literally have sound effects and voice acting in them now. It's like, is this
Yeah.
even an audiobook? This is like a radio show to,
Well, it's like a radio show back in the day.
yeah. And so then what you do is you take, okay, well then what are podcasts now? We're kind of getting to this place where you can have audio theater, documentary, storytelling, long form, audiobook. It's maturing into a space where I think and would like to think that the audience has the palate these days to even take in all these different nuanced experiences. And yeah, you can tune into your show that talks about Zelda, or you can tune into your news show, or you can tune into your show about the guy who's mad about stuff all the time. But you can also tune into these shows that I hope, I guess, because I come from a film background, really. At Columbia, it started as film. I'm hoping that the medium is maturing into something where some real art can be made too. And I only hope that I'm experimenting with that with returning student and also weird projects like the AI show.